Hello everyone and welcome to a very special Half in the Bag holiday special. Unlike many holiday specials, we're going to be kicking it old school, in which I have selected two stories from the yesteryear time periods. We are going to be doing some old school ghost stories. So before the commercialism of Christmas really set in, especially in Victorian England and early America, ghost stories were a large way that people passed the time as the months were cold, days were short, and there wasn't much light. Didn't have electricity. So, I've got two story selections for you. Hopefully you will enjoy them. If you stick around, thank you very much. If you don't, well, that's cool too. But enjoy a nice fire video in the background as I regale you with these two selections that I have prepared. Today we'll be reading the, looking at the wrong title, The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards. And then The Kit Bag by Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. Alright, and without further ado, Merry Spoopy Christmas, and enjoy a more classic holiday haunting tale. The Phantom Coach by Amelia B. Edwards. The circumstances I am about to relate to you have the truth to recommend them. They happened to myself, and my recollection of them is as vivid as if they had taken place only yesterday. 20 years, however, have gone by since that night. During those 20 years I have told the story to but one other person. I tell it now with a reluctance which I find it difficult to overcome. All I entreat, meanwhile, is that you will abstain from forcing your own conclusions upon me. I want nothing explained away. I desire no arguments. My mind on this subject is quite made up, and, having the testimony of my own senses to rely upon, I preferred to abide by it. Well, it was just 20 years ago, and within a day or two of the end of the grouse season, I had been out all day with my gun and had had no sport to speak of. The wind was due east, the month December, the place a bleak wide moor in the far north of England, and I had lost my way. It was not a pleasant place in which to lose one's way, with the first feathery flakes of coming snowstorm just fluttering down upon the heather, and the leaden evening closing in all around. I shaded my eyes with my hand, and stalled anxiously into the gathering darkness, where the purple moorland melted into a range of low hills, some 10 or 12 miles distant. Not the faintest smoke wreath, not the hills. Not the tiniest cultivated patch, or fence, or sheep track met my eye in any direction. There was nothing for it but to walk on, and take my chance of finding what shelter I could, by the way. So I shouldered my gun again, and pushed wearily forward, for I had been on foot since an hour after daybreak, and had eaten nothing since breakfast. Meanwhile the snow began to come down with ominous steadiness, and the wind fell. After this, the cold became more intense, and the night came rapidly up. As for me, my prospects darkened, with the sky darkening, and my heart grew heavy as I thought how my young wife was already watching for me through the window of our little inn parlor, and thought of all the suffering in store for her throughout this weary night. We had been married 4 months, and having spent our autumn in the Highlands, we were now lodging in a remote little village situated just on the verge of the great English moorlands. We were very much in love, and, of course, very happy. This morning, when we parted, she had implored me to return before dusk, and I had promised her that I would. What would I not have given to have kept my word? Even now, weary as I was, I felt that with a supper, an hour's rest, and a guide, I might still get back to her before midnight, if only guide and shelter could be found. And all this time the snow fell and the night thickened. I stopped and shouted every now and then, but my shouts seemed only to make the silence deeper. Then a vague sense of uneasiness came upon me, and I began to remember stories of travelers who had walked on and on in the falling snow, until, wearied out, they were fain to lie down and sleep their lives away. Would it be possible, I asked myself, to keep on thus through all the long dark night? Would there not come a time when my limbs must fail and my resolution give way? When I, too, must sleep the sleep of death? Death! I shuddered. How hard to die just now, when life lay so also bright before me. How hard for my darling, whose whole loving heart, but that thought was not to be borne. To banish it, I shouted again, louder and longer, and then listened eagerly. Was my shout answered, or did I only fancy that I heard a far-off cry? I hallooed again, and again the echo followed. Then a wavering speck of light came suddenly out of the dark, shifting, disappearing, growing momentarily nearer and brighter. Running towards it at full speed, I found myself, to my great joy, face to face with an old man and a lantern. "Thank God!" was the exclamation that burst involuntarily from my lips. Blinking and frowning, he lifted his lantern and peered into my face. "What for?" growled he, sulkily. "Well, for you." I began to fear I should be lost in the snow. Then folks do get cast away hereabouts fro time to time, and what's to hinder you from being cast away likewise, if the Lord's so minded?" "If the Lord is so minded that you and I shall be lost together, friend, we must submit," I replied. "But I don't mean to be lost without you. How far am I now from Dwodling?" "A good 20 miles, more or less." "And the nearest village?" "The nearest village is Wyke, and that's 12 mile the other side." "Where do you live, then?" "Out yonder," said he, with a vague jerk of the lantern. "You're going home, I presume?" "Maybe I am." "Then I'm going with you." The old man shook his head and rubbed his nose reflectively with the handle of the lantern. "It ain't no use," growled he. "He 'ont let you in, not he." "We'll see about that," I replied briskly. "Who is he?" "The master." "Who is the master?" "That's not to you," said the unceremonious reply. Well, you lead the way, and I'll engage that the master shall give me shelter and a supper tonight." "You can try him," muttered the reluctant guide, and still shaking his head, he hobbled, gnome-like, away through the falling snow. A large mass loomed up presently out of the darkness, and a huge dog rushed out, barking furiously. "Is this the house?" I asked. "Aye, it's the house. Down be." And he fumbled in his pocket for the key. I drew up close behind him, prepared to lose no chance of entrance, and saw in the little circle of light shed by the lantern that the door was heavily studded with iron nails, like the door of a prison. In another minute he had turned the key, and I had pushed past him into the house. Once inside, I looked round with curiosity, and found myself in a great raftered hall, which served, apparently, a variety of uses. One end was piled to the roof with corn, like a barn. The other was stored with flour sacks, agricultural implements, casks, and all kinds of miscellaneous lumber, while from the beams overhead hung rows of hams, flitches, and bunches of dried herbs for winter use. In the center of the floor stood some huge object, gauntly dressed in a dingy wrapping cloth, and reaching halfway to the rafters. Lifting a corner of this cloth, I saw, to my surprise, a telescope of very considerable size, mounted on a rude movable platform, with 4 small wheels. The tube was made of painted wood, bound round with bands of metal rudely fashioned. The speculum, so far as I could estimate its size in the dim light, measured at least 15 inches in diameter. While I was yet examining the instrument, and asking myself whether it was not the work of some self-taught optician, a bell rang sharply. "That's for you," said my guide, with a malicious grin. "Yonder's his room." He pointed to a low black door at the opposite side of the hall. I crossed over, rapped somewhat loudly, and went in, without waiting for an invitation. A huge, white-haired old man rose from a table covered with books and papers, and confronted me sternly. "Who are you?" he said. "How came you here? What do you want?" "James Murray, barrister at law, on foot across the moor, meat, drink, and sleep." He bent his bushy brows into a portentous frown. "Mine is not a house of entertainment," he said haughtily. "Jacob, how dared you admit this stranger?" "I didn't admit him," grumbled the old man. "He followed me over the moor and shouldered his way in before me. I'm no match for 6'2". "And pray, sir, by what right have you forced an entrance into my house?" "The same by which I should have clung to your boat if I were drowning. The right of self-preservation." "Self-preservation?" "There's an inch of snow on the ground already," I replied briefly, "and it would be deep enough to cover my body before daybreak." He strode to the window, pulled aside a heavy black curtain, and looked out. "It is true," he said. "You can stay, if you choose, till morning. Jacob, serve the supper." With this he waved me to a seat, resumed his own, and became at once absorbed in the studies from which I had disturbed him. I placed my gun in a corner, drew a chair to the hearth. Drew a chair to the hearth, and examined my quarters at leisure. Small and less incongruous with its arrangements than the hall, the room contained, nevertheless, much to awaken my curiosity. The floor was carpetless. The whitewashed walls were in parts scrawled over with strange diagrams, and in others covered with shelves crowded with philosophical instruments, the use of many which were unknown to me. On one side of the fireplace stood a bookcase filled with dingy folios, on the other a small organ, fantastically decorated with painted carvings of medieval saints and devils. Through the half-opened door of a cupboard at the further end of the room I saw a long array of geological specimens, surgical preparations, crucibles, retorts, and jars of chemicals, while on the mantel-shelf beside me, amid a number of small objects, stood a model of the solar system, a small galvanic battery, and a microscope. Every chair had its burden. Every corner was heaped high with books. The very floor was littered over with maps, casts, papers, tracings, and learned lumber of all conceivable kinds. I stared about me with an amazement increased by every fresh object upon which my eyes chanced to rest. So strange a room I had never seen, yet seemed it stranger still to find such a room in a lone farmhouse amid those wild and solitary moors. Over and over again I looked from my host to his surroundings, and from his surroundings back to my host, asking myself who and what he could be. His head was singularly fine, but it was more the head of a poet than of a philosopher, broad in the temples, prominent over the eyes, and clothed with a rough profusion of perfectly white hair. It had all the ideality and much of the ruggedness of the characterizes the head of a Louis von Beethoven. There were the same deep lines about the mouth, and the same stern furrows in the brow. There was the same concentration of expression. While I was yet observing him, the door opened, and Jacob brought in the supper. His master then closed his book, rose with more curiosity of manner than he had yet shown, invited me to the table. A dish of ham and eggs, a loaf of brown bread, and a bottle of admirable sherry were placed before me. "I have but the homeliest farmhouse fare to offer you, sir," said my entertainer. "Your appetite, I trust, will make up for the deficiencies of our larder." I had already fallen upon the viands, and now protested, with the enthusiasm of a starving sportsman, that I had never eaten anything so delicious. He bowed stiffly and sat down to his own supper, which consisted primarily of a jug of milk and a basin of porridge. We ate in silence, and when he had done, Jacob removed the tray. I then drew my chair back to the fireside. My host, somewhat to my surprise, did the same, and turning abruptly towards me, said, "Sir, I have lived here in strict retirement for these 23 years. During that time I have not seen as many strange faces, and I have not read a single newspaper. You are the first stranger who has crossed my threshold for more than 4 years. Will you favor me with a few words of information respecting the outer world from which I have parted company so long?" "Pray interrogate me," I replied. "I am heartily at your service." He bent his head in acknowledgment, leaned forward with his elbows resting on his knees, and his chin supported in the palms of his hands, stared fixedly into the fire, and proceeded to question me. His inquiries related chiefly to scientific matters, with the latter progress of which, as applied to the practical purposes of life, he was almost wholly unacquainted. No student of science myself, I replied as well as my slight information permitted. But the task was far from easy, and I was much relieved when, passing from interrogation to discussion, he began pouring forth his own conclusions upon the facts which I had been attempting to place before him. He talked, and I listened spellbound. He talked till I believe he almost forgot my presence, and only thought aloud. I had never heard anything like them. I had never heard anything like it since. Familiar with all systems of all philosophies, subtle in analysis, both in generalization, he poured forth his thoughts in an uninterrupted stream, and, still leaning forward in the same moody attitude, with his eyes fixed upon the fire, wandered from topic to topic, from speculation to speculation, like an inspired dreamer, from practical science to mental philosophy, from electricity to the wire to electricity in the nerve, from Watts to Mesmer, from Mesmer to Reichenbach, from Reichenbach to Swedenborg, Spinoza, Condillac, Descartes, Berkeley, Aristotle, Plato, and the Magi and mystics of the East, were transitions which, however bewildering in their variety and scope, seemed easy and harmonious upon his lips as sequences in music. By and by, I forgot now by what link of conjecture or illustration, he passed on to that field which lies beyond the boundary line of even conjectural philosophy, and reaches no man knows whither. He spoke of the soul and its aspirations, of the spirit and its powers, of second sight, of prophecy, of those phenomena which, under the names of ghosts, spectres, and supernatural appearances, have been denied by the skeptics and attested by the credulous of all ages. The world, he said, grows hourly more and more skeptical of all that lies beyond its own narrow radius, and our men of science foster the fatal tendency. They condemn as fable all that resists experiment. They reject all as false all that cannot be brought to the test of the laboratory or the dissecting room. Against what superstition have they waged so long an obstinate war, as against the belief in apparitions? And yet, what superstition has maintained its hold upon the minds of men so long and so firmly? Show me any fact in physics, in history, in archaeology, which is supported by testimony so wide and so various, attested by all races of men in all ages and in all climates, by the soberest sages of antiquity, by the rudest savages of today, by the Christian, the pagan, the pantheist, the materialist. This phenomena is treated as a nursery tale by the philosophers of our century. Circumstantial evidence weighs with them as feather in the balance. The comparison of cause with effects, however valuable in physical science, is put aside as worthless and unreliable. This evidence of competent witnesses, however conclusive in a court of justice, counts for nothing. He who pauses before he pronounces is condemned as a trifler. He who believes is a dreamer or a fool. He spoke with bitterness, and having said thus, relapsed for some minutes into silence. Presently he raised his head from his hand, and added with an altered voice and manner, "I, sir, paused, investigated, believed, and was not ashamed to say my convictions to the world. I, too, was branded as a visionary, held up to ridicule by my contemporaries, and hooted from that field of science in which I had labored with honor during all the best years of my life. These things happened just 23 years ago. Since then I have lived as you see me living now, and the world has forgotten me as I have forgotten the world. You have my history." "It is a very sad one," I murmured, scarcely knowing what to answer. It is a very common one," he replied. "I have only suffered for the truth, as many a better and wiser man has suffered before me." He rose as if desirous of ending our conversation, and went over to the window. "It has ceased snowing," he observed, as he dropped the curtain and came back to the fireside. "Ceased!" I exclaimed, staring eagerly to my feet. "Oh, if it were only possible, but no! It is hopeless. Even if I could find my way across the moor, I could not walk 20 miles tonight." "Walk 20 miles tonight?" repeated my host. "What are you thinking of?" "Of my wife," I replied impatiently. "Of my young wife, who does not know that I have lost my way, and who is at this moment breaking her heart with suspense and terror." "Where is she?" "At Dawdling, 20 miles away." "At Dawdling," he echoed thoughtfully. "Yes, the distance, it is true, is 20 miles, but are you so very anxious to save the next 6 or 8 hours?" "So very, very anxious that I would give 10 guineas at this moment for a guide and a horse." "Your wish can be gratified at least at a less costly rate," said he, smiling. "The night mail from the north, which changes horses at Dawdling, passes within 5 miles of this spot, and will be due at a certain crossroad in about an hour and a quarter. If Jacob were to go with you across the moor, and put you into the old coach road, you could find your way, I suppose, to where it joins the new one?" "Easily, gladly." He smiled again, rang the bell, gave the old servant his directions, and, taking a bottle of whiskey and a wine-glass from the cupboard, in which he kept his chemicals, said, "The snow lies deep, and it will be difficult walking to-night on the moor. A glass of Usibach before you start." I would have declined the spirit, but he pressed it on me, and I drank it. It went down my throat like liquid flame, and almost took my breath away. "It is strong," he said, "but it will help to keep out the cold, and now you have no moment to spare. Good night." I thanked him for his hospitality, and would have shaken hands, but that he had turned away before I could finish my sentence. In another minute I had traversed the hall. Jacob had locked the outer door behind me, and we were out on the wide white moor. Although the wind had fallen, it was still bitterly cold. Not a star glimmered in the black vault overhead. Not a sound, save the rapid crunching of the snow beneath our feet, disturbed the heavy stillness of the night. Jacob, not too well pleased with his mission, shambled on before in sullen silence, his lantern in his hand and his shadow at his feet. I followed with my gun over my shoulder, as little inclined for conversation as himself. My thoughts were full of my late host. His voice yet rang in my ears. His eloquence yet held my imagination captive. I remember to this day with surprise how my overexcited brain retained whole sentences and parts of sentences, troops of brilliant images and fragments of splendid reasoning, in the very words in which he had uttered them. Musing thus over what I had heard, and striving to recall a lost link here and there, I strode on the heels of my guide, absorbed and unobservant. Presently, at the end, as it seemed for me, of only a few minutes, he came to a sudden halt, and said, "Yon's your road. Keep the stone fence to your right hand, and you can't fail of the way." "This, then, is the old coach road?" "Aye, 'tis the old coach road." "Then how far do I go before I reach the crossroads?" "Nigh up 3 mile." I pulled out my purse, and he became more communicative. "The road's a fair road enough," he said, "for foot passengers, but 'twas over steep and narrow for the northern traffic. You'll mind where the parapet's broken away, close again the signpost. It's never been mended since the accident." "What accident?" The night mail pitched right over into the valley below, a good 50 feet and more, just at the worst bit of road in the whole country. Horrible. Were many lives lost?" "All. 4 were found dead, and the other 2 died next morning." "How long is it since this happened?" "Just 9 year." "Near the signpost, you say? I will bear it in mind. Good night." "Good night, sir, and thank ye." Jacob pocketed his half-crown, made a faint pretence of touching his hat, and trudged back by the way he had come. I watched the light of his lantern till it quite disappeared, and then turned to pursue my way alone. This was no longer matter of the slightest difficulty, for despite the dead darkness overhead, the line of stone fence showed distinctly enough against the pale gleam of the snow. How silent it seemed now, with only my footsteps to listen to. How silent and how solitary. A strange, disagreeable sense of loneliness stole over me. I walked faster. I hummed a fragment of a tune. I cast up enormous sums in my head, and counted and accumulated them at a compound interest. I did my best, in short, to forget the startling speculations to which I had just been listening, and to some extent I succeeded. Meanwhile, the night air seemed to become colder and colder, and though I walked fast, I found it impossible to keep myself warm. My feet were like ice. I lost sensation in my hands and grasped my gun mechanically. I even breathed with difficulty, as though instead of traversing a quiet north country highway, I were scaling the uppermost heights of some gigantic Alp. The lost symptom became presently so distressing that I was forced to stop for a few minutes and lean against the stone fence. As I did so, I chanced to look back up the road, and there, to my infinite relief, I saw a distant point of light, like a gleam of an approaching lantern. I at first concluded that Jacob had retraced his steps and followed me, but even as the conjecture presented itself, a second light flashing into sight, a light evidently parallel to the first, and with approaching the same rate of motion, it needed no second thought to show me that these must be the carriage lamps of some private vehicle, though it seemed strange that any private vehicle should take a road professedly disused and dangerous. There could be no doubt, however, of the fact, for the lamps grew larger and brighter every moment, and I even fancied I could already see the dark outline of the carriage between them. It was coming up very fast, and quite noiselessly, the snow being nearly a foot deep under the wheels. And now the body of the vehicle became distinctly visible behind the lamps. It looked strangely lofty. A sudden suspicion flashed upon me. Was it possible that I had passed the crossroads in the dark without observing the signpost? And could this be the very coach which I had come to meet? No need to ask myself the question a second time, for here it came round the bend of the road, guard and driver, 1 outside passenger, and 4 steaming greys, all wrapped in a soft haze of light, through which the lamps blazed out like a pair of fiery meteors. I jumped forward, waved my hat, and shouted. The mail came down at full speed and passed me. For a moment I feared that I had not been seen or heard, but it was only for a moment. The coachman pulled up, the guard muffled to the eyes in capes and comforters, and apparently sound asleep in the rumble. Neither answered my hail nor made the slightest effort to dismount. The outside passenger did not even turn his head. I opened the door for myself and looked in. There were but 3 travelers inside, so I stepped in, shut the door, slipped into the vacant corner, and congratulated myself on my good fortune. The atmosphere of the coach seemed, if possible, colder than that of the outer air, and was pervaded by a singularly damp and disagreeable smell. I looked round at my fellow passengers. There were all 3 men, and all silent. They did not seem to be asleep, but each leaned back in his corner of the vehicle as if absorbed in his own reflections. I attempted to open a conversation. "How intensely cold it is tonight," I said, addressing my opposite neighbor. He lifted his head, looked at me, but made no reply. "The winter," I added, "seems to have begun in earnest." Although the corner in which he sat was so dim that I could distinguish none of his features very clearly, I saw that his eyes were still turned full upon me, and yet he answered never a word. At another time I should have felt and perhaps expressed some annoyance, but at the moment I felt too ill to do either. The icy coldness of the night air had struck a chill to my very marrow, and the strange smell inside the coach was affecting me with an intolerable nausea. I shivered from head to foot, and turning to my left-hand neighbor, asked if he had any objection to an open window. He neither spoke nor stirred. I repeated the question somewhat more loudly, but with the same result. Then I lost patience and let the sash down. As I did so, the leather strap broke in my hand, and I observed that the glass was covered with a thick coat of mildew, the accumulation apparently of years. My attention being thus drawn to the condition of the coach, I examined it more narrowly, and saw by the uncertain light of the outer lamps that it was in the last stage of dilapidation. Every part of it was not only out of repair, but in a condition of decay. The sashes splintered at a touch. The leather fittings were crusted over with mold, and literally rotting from the woodwork. The floor was almost breaking away beneath my feet. The whole machine, in short, was foul with damp, and had evidently been dragged from some outhouse in which it had been mouldering away for years, to do another day or two of duty on the road. I turned to the third passenger, whom I had not yet addressed, and hazarded one more remark. "This coach," I said, "is in a deplorable condition. The regular mail, I suppose, is under repair?" He moved his head slowly and looked me in the face without speaking a word. I shall never forget that look while I live. I turned cold at heart under it. I turn cold at heart even now when I recall it. His eyes glowed with a fiery, unnatural luster. His face was livid as the face of a corpse. His bloodless lips were drawn back as if in the agony of death, and showed the gleaming teeth between. The words that I was about to utter died upon my lips, and a strange horror, a dreadful horror, came upon me. My sight had by this time become used to the gloom of the coach, and I could see with tolerable distinctness. I turned to my opposite neighbor. He, too, was looking at me with the same startling pallor in his face, and the same stony glitter in his eyes. I passed my hand across my brow. I turned to the passenger on the seat beside my own, and saw, oh heaven! How shall I describe what I saw? I saw that he was no living man, that none of them were living men, like myself. A pale phosphorescent light, the light of petrification, played upon their awful faces, upon their hair dank with the dews of the grave, upon the clothes earth-stained and dropping to pieces, upon their hands, which were at the hands of corpses long buried. Only their eyes, their terrible eyes, were living, and those eyes were all turned menacingly upon me. A shriek of terror, a wild, unintelligible cry for help and mercy, burst from my lips as I flung myself against the door and strove in vain to open it. In that single instant, brief and vivid as a landscape beneath in the flash of summer lightning, I saw the moon shining down through a rift of stormy cloud, the ghastly signpost rearing its warning finger by the wayside, the broken parapet, the plunging horses, the black gulf below. Then the coach reeled like a ship at sea. Then came a mighty crash, a sense of crushing pain, and then darkness. It seemed as if years had gone by when I awoke one morning from a deep sleep, and found my wife watching by my bedside. I will pass over the scene that ensued, and give you in half a dozen words the tale she told me with tears of thanksgiving. I had fallen over a precipice, close against the junction of the old coach road and the new, and had only been saved from certain death by lighting upon a deep snowdrift that had accumulated by the foot of the rock beneath. In the snowdrift I was discovered at daybreak by a couple of shepherds, who carried me to the nearest shelter and brought a surgeon to my aid. The surgeon found me in a state of raving delirium, with a broken arm and a compound fracture of the skull. The letters in my pocket-book showed my name and address. My wife was summoned. to nurse me, and, thanks to youth and fine constitution, I came out of danger at last. The place of my fall, I need scarcely say, was precisely that at which a frightful accident had happened to the North Mail 9 years before. I never told my wife the fearful events which I have just related to you. I told the surgeon who attended me, but he treated the whole adventure as a mere dream born of the fever in my brain. We discussed the question over and over again, until we found that we could discuss it with temper no longer, and then we dropped it. Others may form what conclusions they please. I know that 20 years ago I was the fourth inside passenger in that phantom coach. The Kit Bag by Algernon Blackwood. When the words "not guilty" sounded through the crowded courtroom that dark December afternoon, Arthur Wilbraham, the great criminal K.C. and leader for the triumphant defense, was represented by his junior, but Johnson, his private secretary, carried the verdict across to his chambers like lightning. "It's what we expected," said the barrister, without emotion, "and personally I'm glad the case is over." There was no particular sign of pleasure that his defense of John Turk, the murderer, on a plea of insanity, had been successful, for no doubt he felt, as everybody who had watched the case file, that no man had ever better deserved the gallows. "I'm glad, too," said Johnson. He sat in the court for 10 days, watching the face of the man who had carried out with callous detail one of the most brutal and cold-blooded murders of recent years. The counsel glanced up at his secretary. They were more than employer and employed. For family and other reasons, they were friends. "Ah, I remember, yes," he said, with a kind smile. "And you want to get away for Christmas? You're going to skate and ski in the Alps, aren't you? If I was your age, I'd come with you." Johnson laughed shortly. He was a young man of 26, with a delicate face like a girl's. "I can catch the morning boat now," he said, "but that's not the reason I'm glad this trial is over. I'm glad it's over because I've seen the last of that man's dreadful face. It positively haunted me. Bat-white skin, with the black hair brushed low over the forehead, is a thing I shall never forget, and the description of the way the dismembered body was crammed and packed with lime into that—" "Don't dwell on it, my dear fellow," interrupted the other, looking at him curiously out of his keen eyes. "Don't think about it. Such pictures have a trick of coming back when one least wants them." He paused a moment. "Now go," he added presently, "and enjoy your holiday. I shall want all your energy for my parliamentary work when you get back. And don't break your neck skiing." Johnson shook hands and took his leave. At the door he turned suddenly. "I knew there was something I wanted to ask you. Would you mind lending me one of your kit bags? It's too late to get one tonight, and I leave in the morning before the shops are open." "Of course. I'll send Henry over with it to your rooms. You should have it the moment I get home." "I promise to take great care of it," Johnson said gratefully, delighted to think that within 30 hours he would be nearing the brilliant sunshine of the high Alps in winter. But thought of that criminal court was like an evil dream in his mind. He dined at his club and went on to Bloomsbury, where he occupied the top floor in one of those old gaunt houses, in which the rooms are large and lofty. The floor below his was vacant and unfurnished, and below that were lodgers from whom he did not know. It was cheerless, and he looked forward heartily to a change. The night was even more cheerless. It was miserable, and few people were about. A cold, steely rain was driving down the streets before the keenest east wind he had ever felt. It howled dismally along the big, gloomy houses of the great squares, and when he reached his rooms he heard it whistling and shouting over the world of black roofs beyond the windows. In the hall he met his landlady, shading a candle from the draughts with her thin hand. "This come by a man from Mr. Wilbraham's, sir?" She pointed to what was evidently the kit bag, and Johnson thanked her and took it upstairs with him. "I shall be going abroad in the morning, for 10 days, Miss Monks," he said. "I'll leave an address for letters." "And I hope you have a Merry Christmas, sir," she said in a raucous, wheezy voice that suggested spirits, "and better weather than this." "I hope so, too," replied her lodger, shuddering as a little wind went roaring down the street outside. When he got upstairs, he heard the sleet volleying against the window panes. He put his kettle on to make a cup of hot coffee, and then set about putting a few things in order for his absence. "And now I must pack. Such as my packing is," he laughed to himself, and set to work at once. He liked the packing, for it brought the snowy mountains so vividly before him, and made him forget the unpleasant scenes of the past 10 days. Besides, it was not elaborate in nature. His friend had lent him the very thing, a stout canvas kit-bag, sack-shaped, with holes round the neck for the brass bar and padlock. It was a bit shapeless, true, and not much to look at, but its capacity was unlimited, and there was no need to pack carefully. He shoved in his waterproof coat, his fur cap and gloves, his skates, climbing boots, his sweaters, snow boots, and ear caps, and then on the top of this he piled his woolen shirts and underwear, his thick socks, puttees, and knickerbockers. The dress suit came next, in case the hotel people dressed for dinner, and then, thinking of the best way to pack his white shirts, he paused a moment to reflect. "That's the worst of these kit-bags," he mused vaguely, standing in the center of the sitting-room, where he had to fetch some string. It was after 10 o'clock. A furious gust of wind rattled the windows as though to hurry him up, and he thought with pity of the poor Londoners whose Christmas would be spent in such a climate, whilst he was skimming over snowy slopes in bright sunshine, and dancing in the evening with rosy-cheeked girls. Ah, that reminded him. He must put in his dancing pumps and evening socks. He crossed over from his sitting-room to the cupboard on the landing where he kept his linen, and as he did so he heard someone coming softly up the stairs. He stood still a moment on the landing to listen. It was Miss Monk's step. He thought she must be coming up with the last post, but then the steps ceased suddenly, and he heard no more. They were at least 2 flights down, and he came to the conclusion they were too heavy to be those of his bulbous landlady. No doubt they belonged to a late lodger who had mistaken his floor. He went into his room and packed his pumps and dress shirts as best he could. The kit-bag by this time was 2/3 full, and stood upright on its own base like a sack of flour. For the first time he noticed that it was old and dirty, the canvas faded and worn, and that it had obviously been subjected to rather rough treatment. It was not a very nice bag to have sent him, certainly not a new one, or one that the chief valued. He gave the matter a passing thought, and went on with his packing. Once or twice, however, he caught himself wondering who it could have been wandering down below, for Miss Monk's had not come up with letters, and the floor was empty and unfurnished. From time to time, moreover, he was almost certain he heard a soft tread of someone padding about over the bare boards, cautiously, stealthily, as silently as possible, and further, that the sounds had been lately coming distinctly nearer. For the first time in his life he began to feel a little creepy. Then, as though to emphasize this feeling, an odd thing happened. As he left the bedroom, having just packed his recalcitrant white shirts, he noticed that the top of the knit-bag loped over towards him with an extraordinary resemblance to a human face. The commas fell into a fold like a nose and forehead, and the brass rings for the padlock just filled the position of the eyes. A shadow, or was it a travel stain, for he could not tell exactly, looked like hair. It gave him rather a turn, for it was so absurdly, so outrageously like the face of John Turk, the murderer. He laughed, and went into the front room where the light was stronger. "That horrid case has got on my mind," he thought. "I shall be glad of change of scene and air." In the sitting-room, however, he was not pleased to hear again that stealthy tread upon the stairs, and to realize that it was much closer than before, as well as unmistakably real, and this time he got up and went out to see who it could be creeping about on the upper staircase at so late an hour. But the sound ceased. There was no one visible on the stairs. He went to the floor below, not without trepidation, and turned on the electric light to make sure that no one was hiding in the empty rooms of the unoccupied suite. There was not a stick of furniture large enough to hide a dog, and then he called over the banisters to Miss Monks. But there was no answer, and his voice echoed down into the dark vault of the house, and was lost in the roar of the gale that howled outside. Everyone was in bed and asleep. Everyone except himself and the owner of the soft and stealthy tread. My absurd imagination, I suppose, he thought. It must have been the wind, after all, although it seemed so very real and close, I thought. He went back to his packing. It was by this time getting on towards midnight. He drank his coffee up and lit another pipe, the last before turning in. It is difficult to say exactly at what point fear begins. When the causes of that fear are not plainly before the eyes, impressions gather on the surface of the mind, film by film, as ice gathers upon the surface of still water, but often so lightly that they claim no definite recognition from the consciousness. Then a point is reached where the accumulated impressions become a definite emotion, and the mind realizes that something has happened. With something of a start, Johnson suddenly recognized that he felt nervous, oddly nervous. Also, that for some time past the causes of this feeling had been gathering slowly in his mind, but that he had only just reached the point he was forced to acknowledge them. It was a singular and curious malaise that had come over him, and he hardly knew what to make of it. He felt as though he were doing something that was strongly objected to by another person, moreover, who had some right to object. It was most disturbing and disagreeable feeling, not unlike the persistent promptings of conscience, almost, in fact, as if he were doing something he knew to be wrong. Yet, though he searched vigorously and honestly in his mind, he could nowhere lay his finger upon the secret of this growing uneasiness, and it perplexed him. More, it distressed and frightened him. "Pure nerves, I suppose," he said aloud with a forced laugh. "Mountain air will cure all that. Ha!" he added, still speaking to himself. "And that reminds me, my snow glasses." He was standing by the door of the bedroom during this brief soliloquy, and as he passed quickly towards the sitting-room to fetch them from the cupboard, he saw out of the corner of his eye the indistinct outline of a figure standing on the stairs, a few feet from the top. It was someone in a stooping position, with one hand on the banister, and the face peering up towards the landing, and at the same moment he heard a shuffling footstep. The person who had been creeping about below all this time had at last come up to his own floor. Who in the world could it be? And what, in the name of heaven, did he want? Johnson caught his breath sharply and stood stock still. Then, after a few seconds' hesitation, he found his courage and turned to investigate. The stairs, he saw to his utter amazement, were empty. There was no one. He felt a series of cold shivers run over him, and something about the muscles of his legs gave a little and grew weak. For the space of several minutes he peered steadily into the shadows that congregated at the top of the staircase, where he had seen the figure, and then he walked fast, almost ran, in fact, into the light of the front room. But hardly had he passed inside the doorway when he heard someone come up the stairs behind him with a quick bound and go swiftly into his bedroom. It was a heavy, but at the same time stealthy footstep, the tread of someone who did not wish to be seen, and it was at this precise moment that the nervousness he had hitherto experienced leaped into the boundary line and entered the state of fear, almost of acute, unreasoning fear. But before it turned into terror, there was a further boundary to cross, and beyond that again lay the reign of pure terror. Johnson's position was an unenviable one. "By Jove, that was someone on the stairs, then," he muttered, his flesh crawling all over, "and whoever it was has gone into my bedroom." His delicate, pale face turned absolutely white, and for some minutes he hardly knew what to think or do. Then he realized intuitively that delay only set a premium upon fear, and he crossed the landing boldly and straight into the other room, where a few seconds before the steps had disappeared. "Who's there? Is that you, Miss Monks?" he called aloud as he went, and heard the first half of his words echo down the empty stairs, while the second half fell dead against the curtains in a room that apparently held no other human figure than his own. "Who's there?" he called again, in a voice unnecessarily loud, and that only just held it firm. "What do you want here?" The curtain swayed very slightly, and as he saw it, his heart fell, as if it almost missed a beat. Yet he dashed forward and drew them aside with a rush. A window, streaming with rain, was all that met his gaze. He continued his search, but in vain. The cupboards held nothing but rows of clothes, hanging motionless, and under the bed there was no sign of anyone hiding. He stepped backwards into the middle of the room, and, as he did so, something all but tripped him up. Turning with a sudden spring of alarm, he saw the kit-bag. Odd, he thought. That's not where I left it. A few moments before, it had surely been on his right, between the bed and the bath. He did not remember having moved it. It was very curious. What in the world was the matter with everything? Had all of his senses gone queer? A terrific gust of wind tore at the shadows, dashing the sleet against the glass with the force of small gunshot, and then fled away howling dismally over the waste of the Bloomsbury roofs. A sudden vision of the Channel next day rose in his mind and recalled him sharply to realities. "There's no one here at any rate, that's quite clear," he exclaimed aloud. Yet at the time he uttered them he knew perfectly well that his words were not true, and that he did not believe them himself. He felt exactly as though someone was hiding close about him, watching all his movements, trying to hinder his packing in some way. "And two of my senses," he added, keeping up the pretense, "have played me the most absurd trick. The steps I heard and the figure I saw were both entirely imaginary." He went back to the front room, poked the fire into a blaze, and sat down before it to think. What impressed him more than anything else was the fact that the kit-bag was no longer where he had left at. It had been dragged nearer to the door. What happened afterwards that night happened, of course, to a man already excited by fear, and was perceived by a mind that had not the full and proper control, therefore, of the senses. Outwardly, Johnson remained calm and master of himself to the end, pretending to the very last that everything he had witnessed had a natural explanation, or was merely delusions of his tired nerves. But inwardly, in his very heart, he knew all along that someone had been hiding downstairs in the empty suite when he had come in, that this person had watched his opportunity and then stealthily made his way up to the bedroom, and that all he saw and heard afterwards, from the moving of the kit-bag to the other things the story has to tell, were caused directly by the presence of this invisible person. And it was here, just when he most desired to keep his mind and thoughts controlled, that the vivid pictures received day after day upon the mental plates exposed in the courtroom of the Old Bailey came strongly to light, and developed themselves in the dark room of his inner vision. Unpleasant, haunting memories have a way of coming to life again just when the mind least desires them, in the silent watches of the night, on sleepless pillows, during the lonely hours spent by sick and dying beds. And so now, in the same way, Johnson saw nothing but the dreadful face of John Turk, the murderer, lowering at him from every corner of his mental field of vision, the white skin, the evil eyes, and the fringe of black hair low over the forehead. All the pictures of those 10 days in court crowded back into his mind unbidden and very vivid. "This is all rubbish and nerves," he exclaimed at length, springing with sudden energy from his chair. "I shall finish my packing and go to bed. I'm overwrought, overtired. No doubt at this rate I shall hear steps and things all night." But his face was deadly white all the same. He snatched up his field-glasses and, walking across the bedroom, humming a music-hall song as he went, a trifle too loud to be natural, and the instant he crossed the threshold and stood within the room, something turned cold about his heart, and he felt that every hair on his head stood up. The kit-bag lay close in front of him, several feet nearer to the door than he had left it, and just over its crumpled top he saw a head and face slowly sinking down out of sight, as though someone were crouching behind it to hide, and at the moment a sound like a long-drawn sigh was distinctly audible in the still air about him between the gusts of the storm outside. Johnson had more courage and willpower than the girlish indecision of his face indicated, but at first such a wave of terror came over him that for some seconds he could do nothing but stand and stare. A violent trembling ran down his back and legs, and he was conscious of a foolish, almost hysterical, impulse to scream aloud. That sigh seemed in his very ear, and the air still quivered with it. It was unmistakably a human sigh. "Who's there?" he said at length, finding his voice. But though he meant to speak with loud derision, the tones came out instead in a faint whisper, for he had partly lost control of his tongue and lips. He stepped forward so that he could see all around and over the kit bag. Of course there was nothing there, nothing but the faded carpet and the bulging canvas sides. He put out his hands and threw open the mouth of the sack where it had fallen over, being only 3 parts full, and then he saw for the first time the round inside, some 6 inches from the top. There ran a broad smear of dull crimson. It was an old and faded bloodstain. He uttered a scream and drew back his hands as if they had been burnt. At the same moment, the kit bag gave a faint but unmistakable lurch forward towards the door. Johnson collapsed backwards, searching with his hands for the support of something solid, and the door, being further behind him than he realized, receiving his weight just in time to prevent his falling, and shut to with a resounding bang. At the same moment, the swinging of his left arm accidentally touched the electric switch, and the light in the room went out. It was an awkward and disagreeable predicament, and if Johnson had not been possessed of real pluck, he might have done all manner of foolish things. As it was, however, he pulled himself together and groped furiously for the little brass knob to turn the light on again, but the rapid closing of the door had set the coats hanging on its swinging, and his fingers became entangled in a confusion of sleeves and pockets, so that it was some moments before he found the switch. And in those few moments of bewilderment and terror 2 things happened that sent him beyond recall over the boundary into the region of genuine horror. He distinctly heard the kit bags shuffling heavily across the floor in jerks, and close in front of his face sounded once again the sigh of a human being. In his anguished efforts to find the brass button on the wall, he nearly scraped the nails from his fingers, but even then, in those frenzied moments of alarm, so swift and alert are the impressions of a mind keyed up by vivid emotion, he had time to realize that he had dreaded the return of the light, and that it might be better for him to stay hidden in the merciful screen of darkness. It was but the impulse of a moment, however, and before he had time to act upon it, he had yielded automatically to the original desire, and the room was flooded again with light. But the second instinct had been right. It would have been better for him to have stayed in the shelter of the kind darkness, for there, close before him, bending over the half-packed kit bag, clear as life in the merciless glare of the electric light, stood the figure of John Turk, the murderer. Not 3 feet from this man stood the fringe of black hair marked plainly against the pallor of the forehead, the horrible presentment of the scoundrel, as vivid as he had seen him day after day in the Old Bailey, when he stood there in the dock, cynical and callous, under the very shadow of the gallows. In a flash, Johnson realized what it all meant. The dirty and much-used bag, the smear of crimson with the top, the dreadful stretched condition of the bulging sides. He remembered how the victim's body had been stuffed into a canvas bag for burial, the ghastly dismembered fragments forced with lime into the very bag, and the bag itself produced as evidence. It all came back to him clear as day. Very softly and stealthily his hand groped behind him for the handle of the door, but before he could actually turn it, the very thing that he most of all dreaded came about, and John Turk lifted his devil's face and looked at him. At the same moment, the heavy sigh passed through the air in the room, formulated somehow into words. "It's my bag, and I want it." Johnson just remembered clawing the door open, and then falling in a heap upon the floor of the landing as he tried frantically to make his way into the front room. He remained unconscious for a long time, and it was still dark when he opened his eyes and realized that he was lying, stiff and bruised, on the cold boards. Then the memory of what had seen rushed back into his mind, and he promptly fainted again. When he woke the second time, the wintry dawn was just beginning to peep in at the windows, painting the stairs a cheerless, dismal grey, and he managed to crawl into the front room and cover himself with an overcoat in the armchair, where at length he fell asleep. A great clamour woke him. He recognized Miss Monk's voice, loud and voluble. "What, ain't you been to bed, sir? Are you ill, or has anything happened? And there's an urgent gentleman to see you, though it ain't 7 o'clock yet, and—" "Who is it?" I stammered. "I'm all right, thanks. Fell asleep in my chair, I suppose." "Someone from Mr. Wilbram's, and he says he ought to see you quick before you go abroad, and I told him—" "Show him up, please, at once," said Johnson, whose head was whirling and his mind was still full of dreadful visions. Mr. Wilbram's man came in with many apologies and explained briefly and quickly that an absurd mistake had been made, and that the wrong kit-bag had been sent over the night before. Henry somehow got hold of one of the courtroom, and Mr. Wilbram only discovered it when he saw his own lying in his room, and asked why it had not gone to you, the man said. "No," said Johnson stupidly, "and he must have brought you the one from the murder case instead. I'm afraid," the man continued, with the ghost of an expression on his face, "the one John Turk packed the dead body in. Mr. Wilburn's awfully upset about it, sir, and told me to come over first thing this morning with the right one, as you were leaving by the boat." He pointed to a clean-looking kit-bag on the floor, which he had just brought. "And I was to bring the other one back, sir," he added casually. For some minutes Johnson could not find his voice. At last he pointed in the direction of his bedroom. "Perhaps you would kindly unpack it for me. Just empty the things out on the floor." The man disappeared into the other room and was gone for 5 minutes. Johnson heard him shifting to and fro of the bag and the rattle of the skates and boots being unpacked. "Thank you, sir," the man said, returning with the bag folded over his arm. "And can I do anything more to help you, sir?" "What is it?" Johnson asked, seeing that he still had something he wished to say. The man shuffled and looked mysterious. "Beg pardon, sir, but knowing your interest in the Turk case, I thought you'd maybe like to know what's happened." "Yes?" "John Turk killed himself last night with poison immediately on getting his release, and he left a note for Mr. Wilbram saying as he'd be much obliged if they'd have him put away, same as the woman he murdered, in the old kit-bag." "What time did he do it?" asked Johnson. 10 o'clock last night, sir, the wardener says. And with that, I wish everyone a happy new year, Merry Christmas, happy holidays. Thank you again for joining us on this special half-in-the-bag Christmas ghost story. We'll see you all next year with the full cast and get right back into it. All right. Good night.